On behalf of Her Excellency Minata Samati Sisuma, Commissioner for Health, Humanitarian Affairs and Social Development of the African Union Commission, the African Academy of Languages, ACALAN, is glad to take part in this inaugural edition of the World Kiswahili Day. The proclamation of 7 July as World Kiswahili Day by the member states of UNESCO during its 41st session in Paris in November 2021 is an extension of the United Nations Organization's initiative to dedicate a day to each of its official languages as a way of informing and raising awareness about the use, history, and cultures linked to these languages. Africa is largely a multilingual continent, and the African Union and UNESCO are both committed to respect and maintain this multilingual reality convivially, even as we seek a language of wider communication in Africa. Both multilingualism and the idea of promoting a language of wider communication in Africa supports the linguistic expression of the African Union's political will, the will of the African people. And if the Lingua Franca project materializes, it will strengthen the African identity and linguistically assure the continent a place on the world stage. The language question of Africa requires looking at linguistic diversity and to assess how beneficial the Lingua Franca project is in the quest for African integration and development, in showing the urgency and necessity of the idea of finding one or two languages amongst the numerous African languages to elevate to language of wider communication status, and ultimately, as Africa's lingua franca, for instance, the need for common expression for peace, security, and economic integration of Africa, and a common language in summits, negotiations, mediations, and discussions is obvious for Africa. There is also a need to have an Africa whose common language will allow Africans to communicate their needs, aspirations, and ideas in order for Africans to support the weight of their civilization, to borrow Frantz Fanon's words, and in order to attain a Pan-African identity outside the labels of Anglophone, Francophone, and Lusophone. We have to shed off that old colonial skin. We assure you that we are not against any language. All languages are important and assets to the people. All what we are defending is linguistic justice and democracy. For the African people to use their own African languages in their own development. For the African children to learn in their own African languages in their education. Languages that they understand best. For the African people not to depend on other people's languages to the detriment of their own languages. The former colonial languages are partner languages for the African Academy of Languages, ACALAN. Kiswahili is an African language, a Bantu language with terms from Arabic and other Bantu languages, spoken either as a mother tongue or as a fluent second language on the east coast of Africa, and has been one of the official languages of the African Union since 2004, alongside Arabic, English, French, Portuguese, and now Spanish. Kiswahili was adopted as an official language of the Pan-African Organization as part of the political will and efforts of African leaders to enable Africa to use African languages in Africa's development. This is one of the most important milestones and developments in the trajectory of Kiswahili. Kiswahili has a great potential as a language of wider communication in Africa, thanks to factors which include its strategic position, history, and structure. Kiswahili is already a powerful tool of inclusion at local, national, and regional levels in the East and Central African regions. Kiswahili is the lingua franca for a highly multilingual region of over 200 ethno-linguistic communities, with a population of approximately 200 million people in the United Republic of Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, and the African diaspora. Kiswahili is an important ingredient to foster diversity and inclusion in the region, especially in the East African community, for regional integration and sustainable development. Kiswahili is used beyond the East African region. Recently, in the South African school curriculum, which lends credence to the great potential of Kiswahili to be used as a language of wider communication in Africa, for the African people to speak with one voice. The African Academy of Languages, ACALAN, as a specialized institution of the African Union, mandated to develop and promote African languages as a factor of African integration and development, and to provide technical support to member states of the African Union for the development and implementation of language policies and strategies of language development and use, has worked considerably to promote Kiswahili, and therefore developed the Dar es Salaam Framework for Action in June 2019. In Dar es Salaam, in collaboration with the UNESCO Regional Office in the United Republic of Tanzania, the Kiswahili Commission of East Africa, Kamishenia Kiswahili Afrika Mashariki Kakama, and the Kiswahili Council of Tanzania, BAKITA, and other partner institutions of ACALAN as a collective commitment to action by African governments to ensure that Article 25 of the African Union Constitutive Act, formerly Article 29 of the Organization of African Unity Charter, which states that the working languages of the African Union and all its institutions shall be, if possible, African languages, Arabic, English, French, and Portuguese be implemented. Subsequently, the heads of state and government of member states of the African Union, during their 35th ordinary session in February 2022, adopted the Assembly Decision EU December 796, which corresponds to the Dar es Salaam Framework for Action, to make Kiswahili a working language of the African Union and a language of wider communication in Africa. The recommendations of the consultations carried out by ACALAN and its organs and working structures following the adoption of the Dar es Salaam Framework for Action by the African Union identified the need to organize consultative meetings in the regions of Africa and in the African diaspora to establish regional committees and to determine implementation strategies. It is within this context that ACALAN organized the regional consultative meeting for the East Africa region on May 10 and 11, 2022 in Kigali, Rwanda. The following recommendations, amongst others, were made during this meeting, the implementation of which, I'm sure, will contribute to the effective promotion of Kiswahili. Embassies of Kiswahili-speaking countries, Tanzania and Kenya, for example, should set up cultural centers and promote the teaching of Kiswahili in other African countries to popularize the language in collaboration with the African Academy of Languages. ACALAN's proposed Kiswahili Writers Competition, the prize for excellence for literary works in Kiswahili, should be implemented. The regional economic communities, which are the building blocks of African integration and development, should take part in the implementation of the Dar es Salaam Framework for Action. Implementation and resource mobilization committees for the Dar es Salaam Framework for Action should be established. ACALAN's initiative of goodwill ambassadors for each region to be adopted to support the resource mobilization process. Singers, writers, performers, celebrities should be included as assets for the fundraising program. The key activities for stakeholders overall should be to actualize Kiswahili's 2 roles by July 2023. Kiswahili as a working language of the African Union and Kiswahili as a language of wider communication in Africa. To achieve the working language objective for Kiswahili, translators and interpreters should be trained. Baraza la Kiswahili la Taifa BAKITA and the Institute of Kiswahili Studies, University of Dar es Salaam, should collaborate with the African Academy of Languages, ACALAN, in training translators and interpreters. ACALAN should operate its Pan-African Center for Interpretation and Translation and collaborate with the African Union's Pan-African University on the training needs for Kiswahili translators and interpreters. To achieve the language of wider communication objective, Kiswahili should be introduced in the African education system as one of the languages within the implementation of the mother tongue-based multilingual education program recommended by the African Union and UNESCO. ACALAN should engage in language policy advocacy to ensure that all member states of the African Union develop language policies that attribute status and valorizing functions to African languages and recognize Kiswahili as a language of wider communication in Africa. ACALAN should have the language plan of action for Africa revised for Kiswahili to have central role in it. I would like to seize this opportunity to say that ACALAN organized in January 2022 the inaugural edition of the African Languages Week under the theme African Languages, Levers for the Africa We Want, following the adoption in October 2018 in Algiers, Algeria, of the African Languages Week by the Third Specialized Technical Committee on Youth, Culture, and Sport of the African Union. The African Languages Week is a perpetual rendezvous and a major annual event which is held from January 24 to 30 and which should be celebrated by all member states of the African Union to identify the relevance of African languages and cultures in Africa and in the African diaspora, and as a moment to affirm the African identity. To conclude, I want to say that Kiswahili has the ability, the potential to unify and globalize from below, and has evolved democratically through language policy without any form of discriminatory representation that perpetuate inequality or exclusion. Many countries in Africa and abroad are already teaching Kiswahili at different levels of their curriculum. If effectively promoted, Kiswahili would be very crucial for the empowerment and active participation of the African people in their own development, in their own education, in affirming their own identities, which is a factor of peace, progress, and prosperity for the African continent. We congratulate and thank UNESCO on behalf of Her Excellency Minata Samati Susuma, Commissioner for Health, Humanitarian Affairs and Social Development of the African Union Commission, for its collaboration with UNESCO and contribution to the development and promotion of African languages and cultures, especially for the attribution of an International Day to Kiswahili. We thank the governments of the member states of the African Union, particularly governments of the East African Community, for their determined efforts in the promotion of Kiswahili. Long live the World Kiswahili Language Day. Long live African cultures and languages. Long live UNESCO. Long live the African Union. Long live the partnership between UNESCO and the African Union through the African Academy of Languages. Asanteni sana.